I'm not...
You need him to do better.
Well, I'm leader of the SNP. I think it's a tough enough job leading your own party in an election campaign. I think other parties have got to, take their own decisions and look after themselves. The one point I would make and keep making, though, is whatever the polls are saying, and actually there has been a narrowing of the polls in the UK in the last few days, but whatever they're saying, it's not inevitable. People will decide the outcome of the election how they vote next week. So we can stop Boris Johnson getting a majority, but people have to get out there and vote for the party most likely to do that. And in Scotland, that is the SNP. Obviously, I'm the SNP leader, I would say that, but factually that's the case. We are the party that can stop Boris Johnson in Scotland, and that's why I would say to people who don't want Boris Johnson to be deciding our future is to get out there and vote SNP.
Leona, thanks ever so much for that.
Thank you, Leona.
Thank you.
Take care, have a good day. Here's Megan on the beautiful Isle of Skye, the very busy Isle of Skye during the summer. We have to say as well. That's another matter. Megan, what would you like to say?
Hi, so my question is basically that Brexit has left us in a real limbo, and I'm wondering how you can guarantee that a push for Scottish independence wouldn't do the same and leave us with a lot of unanswered questions.
Well, good morning, Megan. What's the weather like in Skye this morning? Is it nice?
It's quite nice, actually, yeah.
It's excellent.
The Misty Isle.
Excellent. Beautiful, beautiful place. Look, that's a really good question. It's one I get asked a lot, and the answer I will give you is that I don't think we should allow the mess that has been made of the Brexit process to lead us to assume that all change has to be like that. I mean, I oppose Brexit, but there was nothing inevitable about the mess it's become. And that has been because in advance of the Brexit referendum, people weren't honest and frank about the implications. There was no real prospectus put forward about the detail of what Brexit would mean. You had that, lie on the side of the bus and not much more. Then, after the referendum, there was still no planning. Theresa May had all her red lines that contradicted each other. Nobody ever levelled with people about the implications and the trade-offs and the compromises that Brexit would entail. Now, if you go back to the independence referendum in 2014, people had different views, but there was a detailed prospectus put forward. Some of the compromises were set out in advance.
We were never clear on the currency situation.
I think we were clear, actually, and that's one of the examples of where the Yes campaign, and it wasn't entirely popular with everybody on the Yes side, we said, look, we would propose a currency union, trade-offs, compromises in that, but we put forward that detail in advance so that people had the clarity about what they were voting for. And I would always want that to be the case when people came to choose independence, that they had the detail to inform that decision.
Megan?
Yeah, so do you feel as well that if there was an independence referendum to come around this time, there would be more answers for us than there were in 2014?
I would endeavour to give people the answers that they were looking for as far as I possibly could. I did that in 2014. I would do that in future. I mean, the one caveat I would inject there is that, whether Scotland's independent or not, whether the UK is in or out of Brexit, the future is never entirely certain. Things happen that you can never foresee in advance. And I think, again, there's got to be a frankness about that. And fundamentally, I would apply this to people's lives as individuals. Fundamentally, you're better able to navigate life's uncertainties if you're in charge of the decisions that enable you to do that. So being independent is not a guarantee that the country won't have rocky times and ups and downs. Nobody can promise that. But it means we are in charge of how we get through those, as opposed to having Boris Johnson, strings being pulled by Nigel Farage, making these decisions. What if
Boris Johnson wins this election? Refers to the point that Leona made as well. If Boris Johnson wins the election, and you'll have looked at every possibility, no doubt, if he does, does that not leave independence dead in the water for a while?
No, I don't think it does. And, you're probably going to ask me, what will I... If I end up in that scenario, I'll set out then how I intend to cross that bridge.
Why don't you do a Catalan and have an unofficial referendum?
Because it doesn't lead to independence, and Catalonia is the proof of that. And I've got great sympathy with the position the independence movement is in there. Obviously, some of their leaders are serving right now lengthy jail sentences. But
that's not going to happen.
I hope not. I'm not anticipating it. But the point I'm making is I'm not in the business of simply having an independence referendum. I want Scotland to become independent. So a process that leads to that has to be legitimate, has to be accepted. And, in short answer to your question, why not do a Catalonia? Catalonia is not yet independent, which demonstrates that kind of process doesn't necessarily take you where you want to be.
And another 4 or 5 years of Conservative government under Mr Johnson, that's not going to be possible, is it? They're not going to all of a sudden say, go on then, Nicola, go for it. I love that's the case.
I love how, contrary to all of the evidence we've had ever since he became Prime Minister, everybody thinks Boris Johnson is going to stick to his word on anything. But let me cross that bridge if I come to it. We're in an election campaign, and people in Scotland have the opportunity to try to avoid us being in that situation by voting in a way that helps to ensure that Boris Johnson is not calling the shots come a week on Friday, the day after the election. And that's what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to do everything, knock my pan in, as we say in Scotland, to avoid Boris Johnson getting a majority. And I would encourage everybody who doesn't want Boris Johnson to be deciding our future to get out there and vote to reduce the chances of that happening.
There's a few more televised debates, so you can knock a few of other people's pans in as well. With that. Finlay in Carlisle in a second, but let's go for Robert in Glasgow. Hello, Robert.
Good morning, First Minister.
Good morning, Robert.
The question I'd like to pose, Nicky kind of asked it already for me, but if Westminster were to refuse second Indie ref, where would that leave us legally? Would be my question.
Well, it's a question that I get asked a lot, Robert, and I'm going to probably frustrate you in that I'm not going to get dragged into the sort of whys and wherefores of that, because we're in an election campaign and I want to focus on trying to stop Boris Johnson getting a majority. Now, suffice to say, I've thought through all of these things. We'll look at all options if we get into that situation. I've made very clear it has to be a legal, legitimate process if we want it to lead to independence. But, the more, particularly in advance of the election, we talk about what happens if we get into that situation. We almost legitimise the right of Boris Johnson to block an independence referendum. He doesn't have that right. Morally, it's not for Westminster politicians to decide whether or not Scotland becomes independent. It's for the people of Scotland.
Legally, he does, though, constitutionally.
Well,
morally is one thing.
That's never been tested. I've accepted the need to have that proper legal process, but actually, in point of fact, it's never been tested in court exactly what the position would be. But politically, I mean, I'm a politician, so perhaps it's not surprising I say this, but let's get the political solutions if we can. And the first step in this is to try to make sure that Boris Johnson is not calling the shots the day after this election. If you don't want to wake up, for whatever reason, on Friday the 13th of December and turn on your television to pictures of Boris Johnson walking back through the door of Downing Street, then in Scotland, get out and vote SNP, because that's the way to stop it. And then, we move on to have control of the kind of future we want and the kind of country we want to be.
And thank you so much, Robert.
Thanks, Robert.
Cheers. Finlay in Carlisle. Hello, Finlay.
Yes, good morning. My question is, why is being in the EU going to benefit an independent Scotland, considering it's likely there will be only 6 MEPs among 750?
Well, good morning, Finlay. Thanks for phoning in. An independent Scotland would have more MEPs than we do just now, based on countries of similar size. I think I'm correct, and if my memory is correct in saying this, will be correct if I'm not getting it entirely right, would have about double that. Of course, the European Parliament is one of the institutions of the European Union, and independent Scotland would, have a commissioner and be at the top table in the European Council as well. I mean, people ask me sometimes, and it's on the face of it, I think, a legitimate question. Why do you want to be independent of the UK but be part of the European Union? And my answer is that these two things are not the same. Every member of the EU is an independent country. France and Germany, Spain, Portugal, all of these countries are independent. But they come together in the EU to cooperate and collaborate on the big issues that, in the modern world, individual countries can't do on their own.
How long would it take for Scotland to rejoin?
I'm not going to sit here and put a specific timescale on that, because there would be a process of discussion and negotiation.
Are we talking 2 years? Are we talking 4 years? Are we talking 6 years? You must have an idea. You must have gamed it.
I'm not going to do that Brexiteer thing of just making things up as I go along to make it easier to answer your question. We'd have a process of discussion and negotiation.
Fairly crucial.
Absolutely, but I want to focus first of all on seeing if we can stop Scotland being taken out of the European Union in the first place. If that happens and we become independent, everything that I have gathered from conversations and discussions I've had across Europe is that Scotland would be welcomed with open arms. It would not be... In fact, there's people within the European Union are on record, people who are expert on these things are on record as saying it would not be a lengthy process.
Have you spoken to Angela Merkel about this?
No, I've not spoken directly to Angela Merkel about this, but there is nothing... When you think about this logically, the European Union, since the moment it was established in former guises, has existed to enlarge itself. It's tried to enlarge itself.
Why would it not want Scotland, that complies with all the rules and regulations, to be part of it? Now, of course, there would be a process to go through, but there is nothing to suggest that that would be a lengthy process or an overly complex process.
And a frictionless border with England?
That is what I absolutely want. Independence doesn't create borders, and I don't want borders. I want to keep trading with the UK. I think it's in the UK's interest to keep trading with Scotland. There is no reason why that shouldn't be the case. But I also want Scotland to be able to keep trading within the European single market, which is 8 times the size of the UK. We shouldn't be forced to choose between these two things. We should be able to do both.
Finlay, are you still with us?
I'm still with you, yes.
How are you going to vote if there's an Indy Ref 2? How are you going to vote there?
I'm going to. I would actually have a vote in Carlisle, but if I did have a vote, I would vote to stay in the UK.
All right. Well, there's a wee bit of work to be done on you then by Nicola Sturgeon.
Of course there is. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Finlay.
Cheers. What if you lose Indy Ref 2? How long? Oh, come on. It's a perfectly legitimate... Don't come on me. It's a perfectly legitimate question because we're thinking about all possibilities at the moment, every single political ramification and implication and potential consequence. If you were to lose, how long before you could have another one?
I'm not planning to lose, and I don't think
I know you're not planning to lose.
Look, I don't know the answer to that question because I'm one politician. I'm not planning to go anywhere soon, but, I'm not going to be around forever. I don't get to decide what the future of Scotland is. That's for people in Scotland to decide. It's not for me any more, actually, than it is for Boris Johnson to say this far and no further, or, this is what the
template at the moment is once
be.
every 6 years. That's the template at the moment.
Well, look, do you know what? If Brexit hadn't, Brexit hasn't happened yet, but if the Brexit vote hadn't happened, with Scotland voting to remain and facing being dragged out against our will, maybe we wouldn't be talking right now about having another independence referendum quite in this timescale. But you can't dictate as a politician what the future of a country is. It's for people to decide that, and people should have the choice. Right now, if we don't get the choice of independence, we are on a path where our future outside the European Union, governed by Boris Johnson, with all of that entails, that is decided for us. It is imposed upon us. And whatever our future is, and it's up to people to decide whether that is as an independent country or not, it should be decided by us, and not decided for us.
The polls are tight at the moment on that. It's 9:23. Nicola Sturgeon is with us. It's on the BBC News Channel. It's here on 5 Live. And a couple of quick-fire questions from our listeners, if I may. Sure. This is John in London via text. Who would Scotland have as head of state if you were to get independence? Now, just following that...
The Queen.
On. Well...
Is the policy of the SNP.
Current policy, yeah. I mean, you said recently that I think there is a debate to be had about the longer-term future of the monarchy. What's your contribution to that debate? Well,
I support current SNP policy. I was asked that question in the context of the Prince Andrew situation, and I was more talking about, which actually... The royal family seem to be having this debate as well about the size and the shape of the royal family in future. So my position is I support current SNP policy, and while, as I was saying a moment ago, I won't be around forever, so I can't dictate that forever. I don't dictate SNP policy anyway. That's my position.
I support current SNP policy. Doesn't sound like a huge warm endorsement of the Queen.
I'm a supporter of the Queen. I think the Queen does an absolutely fantastic job. I think her decades of public service have been exemplary, so I'm very warm about that.
OK, let's go for another one. Alison has tweeted using the hashtag BBC Your Questions. How biased is the BBC?
I don't think the BBC is, but I don't think BBC journalists are biased. I think in the independence referendum, I think there was an institutional issue almost with the BBC to some extent. I don't think it was down to individuals or journalists, but it felt sometimes as if the BBC was on one side of the debate. But that's then. I hope things have moved on from that. Journalists should never be partial. I don't think it should be a case of them trying to do any favours to the independence cause. I think it should be a case of quality, impartial journalism. And I've got great respect for BBC journalists because I think by and large they do a good job.
What do you mean by kind of institutional bias? How did that manifest itself and how does that come to be? I
think, and I would exclude largely BBC Scotland from this, but I remember doing interviews in the latter stages of the independence referendum where some of the network correspondents came to Scotland to cover it, and it was almost as if they hadn't been keeping up, and you were having to sort of go back to square one on issues that people in Scotland were very informed about. And I think there was also, and as I say, I don't think this was in the minds of individual journalists, but as an institution, perhaps there was a sense that the BBC, given its place and role and status in the British media, felt that its own future was somehow caught up in the independence referendum. But I don't think it's particularly seemly for politicians to spend a lot of time criticising the media. We've all got our views on the media. We all get frustrated at times, but the media is there to hold us to account. And whether we always like it, whether we always feel comfortable with it, that's a fundamentally important job in a democracy. And I think politicians, by and large, should seek to avoid criticising the media.
And Nicola in Lanark, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Hi, you can say what you want to Nicola Sturgeon, but go easy on the BBC.
Good morning, Nicola.
Good morning, Nicola. Can we Brexit-proof the NHS for Scotland?
That's a great question, and I think a very timely question. The answer is I think we can. I think Brexit poses a very real threat to the NHS in a whole range of ways. Brexit will make it harder to attract people from elsewhere in Europe, and there's a lot of European nationals work in our NHS. If Brexit harms the economy and lowers tax revenues, then obviously that's less money to be invested in the NHS. But one of the big worries is this idea of the NHS perhaps being on the table in a trade deal with Donald Trump, where it's opened up to private competition or US drug companies push up the price of medicines. The SNP have proposed, and I would hope all parties would support this, we've proposed an NHS protection bill which explicitly stops the NHS being on the table in any trade discussions, and it would also give the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, the Northern Ireland Assembly, and hopefully it will be up and running again soon, effectively the power of veto over trade deals if they were against our interests. So we will put that forward after the election, and I hope all parties, if the Tories are serious and mean what they say when they deny that the NHS would be on the table, then I don't see why they wouldn't support it.
Thank you, Nicola. Sheila in Edinburgh, good morning.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. My daughter was in hospital recently in Edinburgh, and from a parent's viewpoint, the department seemed understaffed and the doctors and nurses stretched to capacity. What will you do to improve staffing in hospitals?
I've got the treatment time guarantee promises that you've broken as well. You haven't got a shining record in the NHS. But to answer Sheila's question...
Mm-hmm. Well, Sheila, firstly, thank you for your question and my best wishes to your daughter.
Thank you.
The NHS is under pressure. It is under pressure in Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, across much of the world as demand rises, as the population ages, which is a good thing. We are investing in our NHS in Scotland. We invest more per head of population than elsewhere in the UK.
You get more per head of population, though, don't you?
Well, we choose to invest. We've reformed the tax system in Scotland in order that we can invest more. We also have more staff per head of population since the SNP took office. There's been about 13,000 more staff working in our health service. I'm not saying they don't work under pressure, because they do day in and day out. On the waiting time stuff, we are, because of that rising demand, we are working hard to improve performance in waiting times, which is why we're investing more. We've done a lot of reforms, integrating health and social care. So we are focused very hard on meeting those challenges, and we've got a waiting times improvement plan in place right now.
the Audit Scotland report. Audit Scotland does a report into the NHS every year, and in its most recent one, it said that more people were being treated within those waiting time targets than had been the case the year before. So there's work to be done there. I would be the last to say otherwise, but we've got a real focus on making sure that we're making the investments, doing the reforms that are about meeting that rising demand.
Are those targets too ambitious?
Yeah. No, I think
90% of patients should have had their treatment commenced within 18 weeks of being referred. In September, the standard was achieved by 76.9% of patients, performance declining from 77.9 in August. Please do.
Sorry. If I could just add to that, I read recently that there are over 4,000 nursing posts unfilled in Scotland. How can that gap be closed to support nursing staff to stay in the profession at the moment?
Sure, I'm not sure about the 4,000 figure. There is a vacancy rate that is pretty consistent with what it's been in recent years. Sometimes it will be slightly higher, sometimes slightly lower. But the figures I've given you for the numbers of staff extra that are working there, these are actually ones in post. So there are more staff than has been the case previously. And one of the things that's been debated in this election elsewhere in the UK is about trying to increase nurses through bringing back the nurse bursary, the bursary that student nurses get, which was taken away by David Cameron. We never abolished it in Scotland. We kept it so that we've been able to attract more nurses into nurse education, which is an important and a good thing to do.
Going back to Nikki's question about are the targets too ambitious? No would be my answer to that. I think you've got to aim high and you've got to keep working to meet those targets. Interestingly, in England, the debate just now is about whether they abolish some of these targets because they're not meeting them.
Because
I don't think we should.
They're a hostage to fortune, aren't they?
Well, they make life difficult for politicians like me sometimes, but actually I think it's better that we have strict targets in place that we're working to meet, because if you don't have those targets in place, then the danger is you do less well. So I'd rather have a tougher time as a politician working hard to meet those targets than actually take the pressure off myself by reducing them. And, that's just the judgment I make. And we will continue to make the investment and do the work to make sure that we're delivering the services that patients deserve to have.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
On the subject of the health of the people of Scotland, look at some of these figures are so depressing. The country's drug death rate is now nearly 3 times that of the UK as a whole, higher than that reported for any other EU country. I think Estonia is second in the table. The rest of the UK quite a bit further down. More than 70,000 drug deaths in the US in 2017, but the rate of 217 per million of the population is marginally lower than Scotland's rate. Obesity, terrible figures. Smoking, depressing figures right at the top of the British League. And the murder rate, there were 11 homicides in Renfrewshire in Reclyde 2017 to 2018, for example. Murder rate 4.3 per 100,000, ahead of New York, ahead of London. Now, perhaps properly, the finger is pointed at any government that has been in for a long time. And I've heard you pointing to the Tories for their social problems. So you've been in for 10 years, Tories, you've not done anything about this. You've been in for 13 years.
Firstly, on your points about the murder rate, violent crime is a 40-year plus low in Scotland right now. Crime generally is at a 40-plus year low. Violent crime has reduced since in the period we've been in office, I think faster than crime generally. So that's not complacency. We need to continue to drive those figures down. But crime has been falling in Scotland. I'll come back to drugs in a second because it's a really important issue. But some of the other issues you mentioned there about big public health challenges, which, have roots that go back a long way. We've taken some really radical action to try to, get ahead of some of these things.
You've been in power for 13 years in Scotland. And just to reiterate the point, any failings in public health, the Tories might be responsible. You're the first to point the finger at them.
No, but I'm taking responsibility here, so I'm about to tell you the kind of things we're doing. So if you take alcohol misuse in Scotland, which has been a problem for a long time, we've become the first government anywhere in the world to introduce minimum unit pricing for alcohol. It's early days, but the early indications of that is that it's having an effect and that alcohol consumption is starting to go down. We're taking tough action to try to tackle obesity, for example. So we are taking the action to, help deal with problems that have roots that go back a long way, that can't be solved overnight, but we're actually doing the work that is needed to turn the tide on these things. On the issue of drugs, which is a big issue right now, again, some of this, not all of it, but some of this has its roots back in the 1980s when Scotland had a higher rate of drug use. A lot of drug users are getting older. They have multiple health problems. That's one of the reasons. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why drug deaths have been rising. Incidentally, although the rate in Scotland is higher, you're absolutely right to point that out, the numbers of drug deaths have been rising elsewhere in the UK as well. So we are doing a lot of work, again, to try to deal with that. We are increasing investment in drug treatment services. We've got a task force looking at some of the additional things we need to do. Crucially, it's taking a lot of advice from people who have lived experience of drug use. We're also, and I should say, this is not me pointing the finger anywhere else, this is largely the responsibility of my government, but drugs law is still in certain respects reserved to Westminster, so we're seeking the transfer of more power, because one of the things that Glasgow City Council has said, backed by experts, it wants to do is establish what's called a safe consumption facility to try to reduce some of the harm associated with drugs. But under the current law, we can't do that. So there's a whole range of things being done here to tackle these problems.
Okay. Raj in Glasgow. Sorry to keep you, Raj. Good morning to you.
Hello, Raj. Hi, Nicola. I'm
Hello.
actually calling from Perth College, actually.
From what college, Raj?
Perth College.
All right, okay.
Yes. So my question is, how will I be impacted after Brexit as an immigrant living in Scotland?
Well, firstly, thank you for being an immigrant living in Scotland. I think everybody who chooses to come to Scotland to make a contribution to our country does us a huge honour, and I think we should be hugely grateful to you for that. I hope Brexit doesn't impact on you, because I want people who've chosen to make Scotland their home to be able to stay and continue to make a contribution. But I do fear the impact of Brexit on the reputation of the UK as a welcoming place. We also know the UK government wants to reduce immigration, which has big implications for Scotland. Our own population over the next 25 years is not growing as fast as we would want it to. All of the growth in our population is projected to come from immigration. So as well as immigration, I think, helping to make us a better, stronger, more diverse society, we really need people to come and work in Scotland in order to make sure that we've got a working age population that is rising. So I will do everything I can to make sure Scotland is and is seen to be a welcoming place for people who want to come and live there. And my message to people in Europe and across the world is Scotland's open for business. Please think about coming and living in Scotland and making a contribution. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. 9:37, some quick-fire questions for you now. Ian has asked for the hashtag BBC Your Questions. If you were living in England, which party would you vote for and why? OK, let's put you in a Labour, Lib Dem marginal. Which way you're voting?
I think I'd have to take the Fifth Amendment on that. I don't know.
The Fifth Amendment's not allowed in this programme. I'm not a fan of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. I think a Labour Party right now, given everything the Tories are doing to this country, should be streets ahead. So that's Lib Dem, is it?
Well, I was going to say I've got real issues with the Lib Dems' previous coalition with the Tories. Joe Swinson voted for austerity, welfare cuts, the bedroom tax. So I'd have real difficulty.
Well, see, you're in the boat. You're in the same boat that a lot of people are in this election, and we see this again and again and again, not just anecdotally. People,
I'm human.
People are going to have to make a choice. People see the worst of the least worst option.
Luckily in Scotland, they've
devil
got
in the deep blue sea and all that.
What I would say, if you're in a constituency where the Tories hold it just now, or the Tories have got any chance of holding it, vote for the party that is best placed to get rid of the Tories or keep the Tories out. That would be my advice to people in England.
Environmental issues. When are you going to turn off the oil taps?
Well, you can't. Firstly, we've got the most ambitious
emissions reduction targets anywhere in the world, and we have a lot of work underway. 75% of Scotland's electricity already comes from renewable energy. We're in that transition away from fossil fuels, and it's got to accelerate. We can't turn off the taps right now, because if we did, we would immediately become more reliant on imports of oil, and that would actually have a higher carbon intensity. We also need to make sure the transition is a fair and a just one. There's lots of jobs dependent on oil and gas in Scotland, and we need to have a transition away from that gets people into other employment. That's why we set up a just transition.
How long is a just transition?
Well, we're governed and guided by the targets we set. So we have set a target of net zero emissions by 2045. That's 5 years ahead of the UK target. We have a target of a 75% reduction in emissions by 2030, because the advice of the experts is that we've got to front load all of this work. So we're guided and governed by those very ambitious targets we set. And unlike other governments, including the UK government, we include aviation emissions,
shipping emissions, and that we don't rely on international credits. So we've made this very tough for ourselves, but rightly so, because it is such an important issue.
You say you're greener than green. The Scottish Greens, this is an issue that's come up before and it's coming up more and more. The Scottish Greens have called for a moratorium on new fish farms, salmon farm industry, until the industry deals with, as they call it, environmental concerns. And they're warning, the recent report by the Scottish Parliament's Environment Committee warned that aquaculture industry would cause irrecoverable damage to the marine ecosystem if these concerns are not addressed. Are you happy with the status quo?
Well, no, we're working right now on a new regulatory framework for aquaculture and salmon farming. It's an important part of our economy. And, as First Minister, I can't just, sort of disregard the jobs that are dependent on that and the value it brings to the Scottish economy. But it must be consistent with our environmental obligations, which is why you mentioned the Scottish Parliamentary Committee. We are looking at taking forward the recommendations there to make sure it is appropriately regulated. And I think that is the right and responsible way to proceed.
At 9:41, you're with the BBC News Channel and also BBC Radio 5 Live. Some more quick-fire questions. Oh, I had one. I did the Living in England. Which party would you vote for?
And I dodged it.
And you dodged it.
Typical politician.
I'll get the real answer after the programme. Colin has texted to say, why would I vote for the SNP and not Labour in Scotland to stop the Conservatives being voted back in?
Well, firstly, in every Conservative seat in Scotland, the SNP is the main challenger. Labour doesn't have a chance. So if you want rid of the Conservatives, vote for the SNP. It's the best, only way to do it. And generally, we're in an election and I'm never complacent, but Labour is miles behind. Labour is not in a position of being able to win in Scotland. If you want to make sure that we get rid of the Tories and have the strongest possible voice for Scotland, then voting SNP is the way to do that.
Jeremy Corbyn's a great man of principle, isn't he?
No, I don't think he is.
Over the years, he's been very consistent. He's voted the same way for a long time on issues he voted against his party because of what he believed in. People like that about politicians.
But surely he should be judged on... It's easy to do that when you're not in a position of influence, but if you look at him now as leader, he's campaigned against Trident for his whole political life, but now he's saying that now that he's leader and a potential Prime Minister, that he thinks we should renew
people
Trident.
In your party who are signing up to keeping the monarchy. They're no doubt not against that, but it's in the manifesto. It's the party line.
Well, people are free to speak out, but on Brexit, we've got Jeremy Corbyn who won't even tell us whether he's for or against Brexit, whether he would vote leave or remain in a future referendum. You can't aspire to be Prime Minister and not actually tell people where you stand on the biggest issue of the day. So actually, I think since he's been Labour leader, as opposed to campaigning from the back benches, this man of principle has actually been shown to be anything but on many issues.
Ben in London. Good morning, Ben.
Good morning.
Hi, all yours.
Morning.
Thank you. Good morning, Nicola. How can the SNP ensure the safety and well-being of trans and non-binary identities in an independent Scotland following the seemingly anti-trans sentiments shared by some of its members?
Oh, tell us about what has been said by some of its members.
Well, straight off the bat, at the wonderful Pride celebrations this year in Edinburgh, 2 campaigners were branded as misogynistic for marching for trans rights. We've got a sort of blossoming gender-critical movement on Twitter, which sees a lot of young trans people affected by things that are said there. There is the Women's Pledge that was set up by the SNP, which many members of the SNP haven't gone on to sign, as they see it as little more than an unregulated petition.
Okay.
And you say in your manifesto you want to make it, you want to streamline it, make it less intrusive, the process for transgender people to be legally recognised in their, as you put it, acquired gender. So to address the point.
Well, let me address the point, and thank you for calling in, Ben. I'm a big supporter of trans rights. I think trans people should have the ability to be who they are, live without the stigma and discrimination that has so often dogged them in the past. I've had so many conversations, and particularly with young trans people, that absolutely convinces me that we've got to tackle that stigma and we've got to tackle transphobia. And there is a lot of transphobia in society, not just in Scotland, but more generally right now. I'm also a lifelong feminist and I'm passionate about women's rights. And I do not believe that those two things need to be in tension.
Is it transphobic to say that women's refuges, swimming pool, changing rooms, women's prisons should be reserved for biological?
Well, that's not the position. I don't think that's the case. I was going to come on to the reform of the Gender Recognition Act. If you look at women's refuges, they have been accessible to trans women for some time. And, the reform of the Gender Recognition Act is about making the process of legally changing gender, as you said a moment ago, less intrusive, less bureaucratic, less traumatic for trans people. It doesn't change the situation with single-sex or women-only spaces. That is governed by the Equality Act, which we're not proposing to change. You don't need a gender recognition certificate to access women's-only spaces right now. The point is, I am a supporter of trans rights, I'm a supporter of women's rights, and I think it is incumbent on people like me to demonstrate that those two things aren't and needn't be in tension and in competition. And we've made a commitment to reform the Gender Recognition Act, which we are committed to, and we will bring forward a draft bill in the near future to hopefully let people see the detail of what we are proposing and, crucially, what we are not proposing, and try to get to a position on this issue where there is a greater understanding and acceptance of these different positions.
There is a great movement of feminists who think this is misogynistic and who think that their rights are being trampled on here. Do you, as what they call the trans lobby, do you respect their position?
Look, I am a lifelong feminist. I would not be proposing something or arguing for something that I thought was, to use your terminology, trampling over women's rights. I've spent a lifetime campaigning for women's rights and women's equality, and that's the point I'm making. I'm not dismissing the concerns that women have. Part of the reason we've said we're bringing forward draft legislation is to try to allay those concerns and to set out very clearly what we are and what we are not doing. But I've also, seen and heard too many experiences on the part of trans people to ignore their lived experience either. So I believe in trans rights. I'm a passionate believer in women's rights, and my responsibility is to try to do what I can to create a Scotland where everybody feels accepted for who they are and able to be who they are without discrimination, stigma, or a fear that their rights are being trampled over. Now, that's not easy in the context of this debate.
In many areas.
But that actually, for somebody in my position, is an important responsibility and one that I'm determined to live up to.
And George in St Coombs. Hello, George.
Good morning.
Morning.
Morning, George.
What's your question?
Will an independent Scotland remain in the common fisheries policy, bearing in mind that a nation that does not control its own waters is not independent or sovereign?
Thanks for your question, George. The SNP's argued against the common fisheries policy almost for the entirety of its existence. We've put forward proposals for reform of the common fisheries policy, and we would continue to do that if we were in the European Union as an independent country. We do believe it is important to have greater control over Scottish waters. But we also know that it's important, and this is where I think the whole Brexit argument falls down, and I think the fishing industry and the fishing communities are being, in many respects, sold a con by the Conservatives because, yes, control over our own waters, being able to land more fish is important, but being able to process the fish is important, and having the people to work in our fish processors, many of whom come from other European countries, and then having the markets to sell our fish into is important as well. And all of these things matter. And that's the position that the SNP would always argue for.
What's your view on this when it comes to Brexit and the Scottish fishing industry? Where are you on this, George?
Well, I'm with the Brexit position. We've had 40 years of promising to reform the common fisheries policy. Even when John Major was Prime Minister, the SNP said they were going to lead us down Princess Street with Alex Salmond in the front. We marched around the back streets of Edinburgh, and we're still wandering in the back streets. We're just completely lost here.
I absolutely understand your frustration.
Just can I add
George?
to this? For voices in the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, Elspeth MacDonald for one, saying that fishing can become Scotland's fastest growing economic sector within 10 years if the UK leaves the EU Common Fisheries Policy on schedule. These are the great opportunities of Brexit.
Well, I think our fishing industry has a bright future, and I accept my responsibility to work with the fishing industry to make sure that's the case. But I do fear that, as has happened so often in the past, we're going to have Conservatives selling out our fishing industry. The political declaration that Boris Johnson has agreed already ties up the future of fishing with a wider trade negotiation, already paving the way to trade that away. So
how do we have sole jurisdiction over our own coastal waters within the European Union?
Well, I believe the common fisheries policy should be fundamentally changed and reformed. But I do think there is an
simplicity in what the Conservatives are saying in terms of we just come out of the common fisheries policy and then everything is rosy, because all of these other things that the fishing industry needs to prosper are at risk. So I'm not a supporter of the common fisheries policy. I never have been. The SNP never has been. But we must be honest about what we need in overall terms for the fishing industry to prosper and to thrive. And as I say, it used to be the Tories that called the fishing industry expendable in the wider interests within the European Union. And I fear that is what the Tories are gearing up for all over again.
Might that be a bit of input you would have into the deal that Jeremy Corbyn might be negotiating with the European Union were he to win? Because he's going to have a Jeremy Corbyn deal and he's going to have remaining. Just on that,
we will always stand up for the interests of the fishing industry.
That might be a tweak. That might be a tweak. Would you want to have somebody negotiating with Jeremy Corbyn to actually get that particular tweak?
I'd want to make sure in any of these discussions the interests of the fishing industry were absolutely paramount, and that's a commitment I would make on behalf of the SNP.
Do you want somebody at the table?
I think Scotland should be at the table in any of these discussions all of the time, rather than being shut out by Westminster. And fishing is an example of the particular interests we have that mean that we should be much more represented.
My goodness me, look at the time, it's 9:52. Let's just remind you what's going on. Leader of the SNP, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, with us until 10 on 5 Live and the BBC News channel, answering your questions. You can get in touch while we're on the air using the hashtag BBC Your Questions. Email your questions at bbc.co.uk, text 85058, charged at your standard message rate. Now let's just go to Martha in Edinburgh. Good morning, Martha.
Morning.
I've got here Labour member.
But I'm really interested in SNP's environmental policies, but my question is particularly about North Sea oil. Mm-hmm. So SNP claims Scotland is a global leader in tackling climate change. However, obviously, Scotland's one of the biggest producers of oil in Europe. In SNP's manifesto, there's no date for stopping oil extraction and no mention of transitioning away from oil at all. How is this compatible with your net zero greenhouse gas emission target by 2045?
Well, firstly, Martha, thank you for your question. I don't claim that Scotland is a world leader. It's a statement of fact. So most international experts at the United Nations call Scotland a world leader. It's not the case that there's no mention of this in our manifesto. We talk about ring-fence. I mentioned earlier on why you can't just switch off oil production overnight, because it would actually be counterproductive to what we're trying to do. But in terms of that transition away from fossil fuels, there is a very significant proposal in our manifesto. We are saying, the Office of Budget Responsibility says that there's £8 billion of oil revenues predicted over the next few years. We've said that should all be earmarked into a net zero fund, which helps to accelerate that transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So there's a lot that we are saying there. That transition has to be accelerated. Scotland again is leading the way here. I think I said a moment ago, 75% of our electricity already comes from renewable sources. We need to make sure that we are emulating that performance when it comes to how we heat our homes.
Do you fly from Edinburgh to London?
I do sometimes, but I've been trying to do that less and to get the train as much as possible.
Just as quick from Edinburgh to London in many ways.
In many ways, it's quicker actually, and it's a much more pleasurable way to travel as well. So I took the train to London last week. We've all got to change how we do things, and people like me in particular.
Nicola, I guess my main concern is how climate change is being pushed onto burdens being pushed onto individuals when actually we need a lot of structural change. And I think it's how are we going to make a just transition for oil workers and their families at this time?
Well, we've set up a Just Transition Commission, which the trade unions are involved in, to advise us on how we do this in a way that doesn't leave people behind. I actually agree with you on the point you made at the start of that question that, yes, individuals, of course, we all have to think about changing our behaviour. But actually, if you look at it's a relatively small number of companies worldwide that are responsible for the vast bulk of emissions. So industry has to play a leading part in this. Governments have to lead by example, because if we don't do that, we're not going to convince individuals to make the changes in their lives. So this is, I'm not sitting here saying there's not much more Scotland needs to do. If we're to meet these targets, we all have to up our game. But I do think in Scotland sometimes, and this probably exists across the party boundaries, we should take a bit of pride in the fact that the rest of the world sees us as a global leader, and that should motivate us to keep doing more.
There's a horrible picture on the BBC website today, news this morning, of a whale found beached in the off the Western Isles.
I've not seen that.
Fishing tackle inside it. It's just really disturbing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right, let's go to, let me see now. We have got, who's next? Mark in Portsmouth. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning.
Hi.
My question to Nicola, morning.
Morning, Mark.
What would happen to the Navy bases, the RAF bases, if Scotland got independence? And who would be in charge of the security of Scotland?
Well, as with any other independent country, many independent countries across the world are similar in size to Scotland or smaller. We would have our own armed forces. We'd have our own Navy, Air Force, Army, and we'd be able to invest in conventional forces. The Army footprint in Scotland is smaller now than at any time in, I think, about 200 years, because actually investment in conventional armed forces has been cut, and there is a disproportionate spend on nuclear weapons. So Scotland would defend itself in the same way other small countries defend ourselves, and the bases that we have right now would become part of Scottish armed forces. And we've absolutely hugely valued the contribution that armed forces make right across the UK.
But wouldn't the ships come back south, or the submarines?
In terms of nuclear submarines?
Yeah. Would they leave Scotland?
Well, I would want to see nuclear weapons leave Scotland. Obviously, that has to be done safely, so there has to be careful thought given to the timescale in which that was to happen. But I've, maybe a point we agree to disagree on. I've got, and always have had, a real moral opposition to nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, if they were used, would kill tens of millions of people, wipe out swathes of civilization. We don't countenance chemical weapons anymore. I don't think we should have these weapons of mass destruction.
But wouldn't it be a big blow to jobs in Scotland?
Well, Faslane, where Trident is based just now, in my view, would become a conventional naval base. So it would still sustain employment because there is a lot of employment there, but it would be a conventional naval base, not a nuclear naval base. And I think that kind of facility is actually much more relevant and important in terms of how Scotland, which is a maritime nation with a big coastline, is much more relevant to how we properly defend ourselves than nuclear weapons are.
But would the London government send ships to Scotland?
In order to be built? There's no reason why not. Our shipyards, there's 2 shipyards on the Clyde that have, some of the best expertise anywhere in the UK. So, when contracts are put there, and we've not had quite the same amount of work there as was promised a few years ago, but nevertheless it's important. But that work goes there not because the UK government is doing these shipyards a favour, it's because of the best place in the UK to build these ships, because they've got the best expertise. OK, thank you very much indeed. We've only got 20 seconds. If Donald Trump, he's coming, if you were to be at a function where he was as First Minister, President, would you shake his hand? I'm a polite person, so I would shake his hand. I've always said as First Minister, if I had to meet him, I'd meet him. But, you know, I'd be pretty blunt with him about what I thought about his policies. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Victoria Derbyshire programme up next, and at 11, BBC Newsroom Live will be bringing you all the day's top stories.
With so many voices vying for your attention during the